I'm Dick Bovair, Secretary of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, and I'll be facilitating this evening's presentation. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Goodby as our featured speaker. Dr. Goodby is Professor of Anthropology at Franklin Pierce University since 2000. He earned his bachelor's degree at UNH in 1986, and at Brown University he earned his master's in 1988, as well as his PhD in 1994. His dissertation topic was on the meaning of the elaboration of contact period ceramics in New England. He has 35 years of experience in New Hampshire archaeology, beginning as a lab assistant in the scrap lab and working on scrap excavations along the Merrimack River. He is a past president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, a former trustee of the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum, and has served on the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs. He is also the sole proprietor of Monadnock Archaeological Consulting, LLC, which he founded in 2004. Tonight, Dr. Goodby will give us an overview of his new book, A Deep Presence in 13,000 Years of Native American History. It's the remarkable story of Native Americans in the Monadnock region of southwestern New Hampshire, and he'll also discuss how he wrote the book.
Good evening. It's very nice to be here. For anyone who does not know me, my name is Bob Goodby. And as Dick said, I've been doing archaeology in New Hampshire for quite a while. And for the past 22 years, I've been centered in the Monadnock region as a professor at Franklin Pierce University and doing a lot of work in that region of the state that hadn't received a tremendous amount of attention. And during the course of that time, I think I was more or less a good archaeologist in that I did what I was supposed to do. I excavated sites and would eventually get them published. And pretty much all my publications were in the standard technical journals that are read by practicing archaeologists, and did some important work in that. But when it came time to write a book, and my wife had been telling me for many years, you ought to write a book. The book that I decided to write was not a technical or scholarly work. It was meant for a general audience. And so tonight I want to talk about what that process was like, what I learned in the course of doing it, a little bit about what is in the book, and sort of how the book has been received to date. So as you can see, the title of the book is A Deep Presence, 13,000 Years of Native American History. And I cribbed the title from a conference we had many, many years ago at Franklin Pierce when I was first there. And the title of that conference was A Deep Presence, really celebrating the long tenure of Native people in this region. But of course, as an archaeologist, it has a double meaning as well, thinking about it in terms of excavating sites. So I started off thinking about this, and the way I wanted to do the book, as many of you know, for quite a while now, I think it's been about 14 or 15 years, I have been a speaker for New Hampshire Humanities. They have a wonderful program called Humanities to Go, and it provides funding for scholars and artists and performers and all sorts of people to go around the state and deliver presentations on their area of expertise to a general audience. And I have two talks that I do for New Hampshire Humanities. I have a broad overview of the archaeology of Native Americans in the state called Digging into Native History in New Hampshire. And then I have a talk that focuses exclusively on the Paleo-Indian site we discovered before the construction of the Keene Middle School. And in doing these talks, I had to develop a different way of communicating about archaeology. Different from what I might do at a professional conference. And I discovered really quickly that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking in the first person. I enjoyed talking informally and describing the work I do in sort of a narrative fashion. And I have traveled all over the state giving these talks. I've lost count of how many, but quite a few. This is a picture of me delivering one this past summer at an old New England meeting house in North Sutton, New Hampshire. Really, really quaint setting. One of the least quaint settings, 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a talk at the New Hampshire State Prison in Berlin, and I've done this at facilities in between. And the idea that archaeologists can be storytellers, I think, is an important one. We're regardless of how we present it, we are telling a story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it moves toward the future, it has unexpected plot twists. And if you deliver it in the right way, it could make for a very compelling story. And I have this quote here from an archaeologist I really admire, the late Jim Dietz, who said archaeologists are storytellers. And this is a guy who he taught at Brown a little bit before I was there. And the department legend was that he wrote his famous book In Small Things Forgotten, which is just a classic of archaeological writing, that he wrote that on a plane trip from the West Coast coming back to Providence. And I love the style of that book. It's accessible, it's interesting, and I had in mind doing with this book the same kind of thing he did. Never make it to the same level, of course, but that was sort of my model. And so the book has in it both of the talks that I do for New Hampshire Humanities, as well as a bunch of other things that I don't normally get to talk about, other sites, other issues, things of that sort, but all of them delivered in the same sort of way. Now, this issue of telling stories and how we present our work has gotten increasing amounts of attention in the archaeological literature. So a year or two back in the SAA newsletter, there was a real focus on this question. And in this article, they're discussing not only how we might go about presenting our work, but the fact that when we just restrict ourselves to technical professional presentations, we leave the public arena to the pseudo-archaeologists and they march right in and take it. And it's one of the things that's always galling, of course, when you see this sort of pseudo-archaeology on the History Channel or wherever else it appears. Not only is it nonsensical, but you're thinking to yourself, the real stuff is every bit as interesting as that, and in fact, more interesting because it's real. And I think it's important for archaeologists to step up and do this, particularly because just in terms of self-interest, we get most of our support from the public. And so if they like our stories and like our work, I think that is good for the discipline. So that's sort of the perspective that I came from in this. And in the book, I draw almost exclusively on work that I've done while I've been at Franklin Pierce. And so it's the story of my work, and it's also the story of my students' work. And so I have a bunch of photographs here, and photographs of my students appear throughout the book. This is really based on a lot of their labor and could not have come about without them. So I want to give credit for that where it is deserved. So I was going to write a book. That was the idea. And I had the perfect opportunity to do it because in the last year, the combination of COVID and just by lucky timing, the fact that I had a year-long sabbatical from Franklin Pierce gave me the opportunity to hunker down in my office and actually get this done. And so when that opportunity came along, I sat down and looked around and thought about it and said, what do I do? Fortunately, I am married to an English professor who knows quite a bit about writing, and I ran the question by her, how do I start this business? And she looked at me and said, this is my wife, Tracy, and she looked at me and said, well, boy, what you need is what writers call a scaffold. You need a framework to put the book together and give you a sense of the order of topics and how those topics are going to lead into each other. And that sort of made sense to me. So I sat down, and in this picture here, those of you familiar with Keene know that we have this wonderful public art and history project that's been done called the Wall Dog Murals that have painted big historical pictures on many of the downtown buildings, including one devoted to the Abenaki. So I thought about what I wanted to talk about in the sequence and sketched it all out on a legal pad. And pretty much what I sketched out is what became the table of contents of the book. So far, so good. I've got a good start. And then I started to write the thing. And that went well too. I found I really enjoyed writing in the first person and talking about the work as a story. But as I was writing it, I realized that I was really telling two stories. My intent had been to tell the story of the Native people in New Hampshire as I've learned about it through the archaeological record. But writing in the first person, I also discovered I was telling my own story, that there was an element of memoir to it. And after thinking about that for a while, I got perfectly comfortable with that. So those two stories sort of weave in and out and bounce off of each other. And things went really well. And within, maybe 3.5 months or so, I had a draft. And then I found out that was going to be the easy part. I have published a number of papers in anthropological journals. I have never written a book before. And when I got down to it, one of the things I learned is that the publishing landscape has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. The old model where you take your manuscript and you shop it around to a publisher and find one who likes it, and then they work on it and get it printed and all like that and handle the distribution. Unless you're a commercially established, successful author, that model doesn't exist anymore. The number of books being sold has declined significantly in the last 15 or 20 years. And publishers are generally unwilling to take on new authors on spec. And so what they are looking for is for authors to bring into the project some sort of financial backing so that the authors and their backer assume the risk and the publisher doesn't get stuck with a whole ton of books. And so that was going to be the reality. And, traditional presses like the University Press of New England, who I had initially thought might be a good outlet for this, well, they're no longer publishing books. And so I had to navigate this landscape. And I thought about how to raise the money for that and quickly thought about and dismissed the idea of a bake sale. And I'm not technologically savvy enough to do a GoFundMe campaign. And it occurred to me that in my time in the Monadnock region, I had worked with some outstanding nonprofit organizations, and I decided that I would turn to them. And so rather nervously, I delivered manuscripts to the Harris Center for Conservation Education. It's a remarkable organization in the Monadnock region. They manage over 8,000 acres of land and are devoted to public education on conservation related issues. And they also include the human history in that as well. And the second entity was the Historical Society of Cheshire County. They're sort of the premier historical society and clearinghouse in Cheshire County. They're based in Keene, and I've worked on many projects with them. So I gave them my manuscript and crossed my fingers, and both organizations were very positive, and they said that they were on board and would help support the publication. I also got some assistance from my employer, Franklin Pierce University. And then the search was on to find a publisher. And I had one already in the back of my mind. I had published a short piece in an anthology edited by the historian Jeff Bolster that was published by Peter Randall Publisher out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And one of the things, they're a small independent publisher, and one of the things they specialize in is books on local history that have got high quality illustrations. And I thought to myself, they might be a good fit. So I made an inquiry, delivered a couple of samples to the publisher, Deirdre Randall, and she was positive. And so everything sort of came together. I had some backing, I had a publisher, and the book was on its way. Now, it's a book that really begs for high quality illustrations. And that, of course, drives up the price of any publication. The more high quality color pictures you have, the more it's going to cost, et cetera, et cetera. But I really felt this was crucial. As you all know, archaeology is a very visible visual enterprise. You need to be able to see the objects you're talking about. You need to be able to see pictures of excavations. And more than that as well, I was also aiming to get my readers to imagine the human story. and to try to picture the people behind the artifacts, even when that was difficult to do. And that was something that made the book a little different. And I have nothing but the greatest respect for technical scientific writing in archaeology. But it's very easy if we're focused on objects or on abstract anthropological arguments to forget that behind all of these objects were real people with complicated lives, with names and identities, and who we could empathize with if we knew enough about them to imagine their lives. And so I tried to use these objects to get there. So I have all sorts of things, a beautiful picture of an Abenaki fancy basket. And that, of course, is probably the thing the Abenaki are best known for in terms of their traditional arts, although this particular form really develops during the Victorian period, becomes a source of a lot of cash income for Abenaki artists. And then going to the other end of the timeline, a beautiful fluted point from Ossipee Lake. And on the cover of the book is an illustration by my friend and colleague, Miranda Nelkin, who's an art teacher at the Keene Middle School, where we discovered the Paleo-Indian site, and has used the archaeology as an inspiration to create a whole series of drawings on not only the Paleo-Indian life in the Monadnock region, but more recent native life as well. And so I put these pictures together, and I am not the world's most talented graphic artist by any means. So I had help from a lot of colleagues. Steve Bailey, the late Steve Bailey, took a lot of the photographs that are in here. I got help from Garrett Evans, who's a superb photographer. I got a lot of help from my friend Mark Greenlee, not only in finding images, but in trying to bring them up to the highest quality. And I start off the book with an introduction, and yeah, that young looking guy with the big grin on his face, that is actually me. People may be looking at that and saying, well, what happened? This is me working at the Eddy site in Manchester, my second summer in archaeology. And let me assure you, this photo does not appear in the book, but I wanted to throw it in here because I start off by talking about how I got into this when I was first working with a scrap program, and how being an anthropology major at UNH led me to sort of stumble into the archaeology of Native people here. And then in that chapter as well, I also talk about some of the loss. And, for all the richness of the sites at Amoskeag Falls, you look at this aerial photo and you can just get a sense of the utter devastation that industrialism has visited on this place. And that sort of leads into a discussion of some of the challenges that we face in trying to reconstruct Native history. I have a short chapter talking about who the Native people are. And I do this in part because my dirty little secret is that I got into this by first falling in love with cultural anthropology. And I've always looked at archaeology through that lens. And so I try to begin thinking of culture first. And for most people who are not involved in this subject, it's one of the first questions they ask. If they find out that you're studying Native sites, they ask, well, who, and it's almost always phrased in the past tense, who were the Native people? As if that's a story that has ended and there's nobody left to carry it forward. And so in this chapter, I talk about, I don't provide an answer necessarily, but I talk about some of the complexities. My belief that the Native people here did not live in a world that had fixed and rigid social boundaries, that their lives were characterized far more by connections with neighboring people than with divisions among them. And what does it mean, if people ask you what tribe they were and you give them a name and they walk away feeling satisfied? Does that really get you anything anywhere close to the reality of Native people? And so I just sort of set the stage by saying, here are some of the things we can say. I talk a little bit about the language and the relationships of the different Native communities to one another, and some of the things we don't know about how the Native people were organized. Then I have a a somewhat lengthy chapter. And again, this is a book for the general public. So I know many of the people tuning in tonight know most or all of this, or may know more about it than I do. But for the layperson, I think it's important to start off and introduce them to our evidence. What sort of things do we find? What sort of things are missing from the archaeological record? And with the things we are able to find, predominantly stone and ceramic and things of that sort, given how poor our preservation is, what can we learn about them? So I talk about stone quite a bit and how identifying quarry sources can help us flesh out patterns of travel and interaction, and see social networks and how they change in the past. I talk a lot about pottery. It's always been an interest of mine, and the different sorts of information you can tease out of these pots, and what they reflect about social organization. I talk about sites like the Mount Jasper Quarry, and what that looks like and how far the stone is distributed. And I also talk about travel. And one of the things that was interesting about writing this book is I actually, as I was doing it, I saw patterns in a way that I hadn't seen before when I was focused just on writing about specific sites or specific topics, patterns that would crop up in every single chapter. And I realized, oh, this is a thing. And one of the things that really grabbed me was the interconnectedness of native societies that you can see going all the way back to the Paleo-Indian period, when you have, rhyolite from the Mount Jasper quarry distributed over a good part of New England, and all the way up to the contact period, when Roger Williams is describing Narragansett sachems taking dugout canoes down Long Island Sound and up the Hudson River to go visit the Mohawk, and then coming back to Narragansett Bay, a round trip of 500 miles. And those interconnections become a real theme that sort of carries through the book. And then I talk about 4 sites that I have worked on with primarily with my Franklin Pierce students, and they're sort of the greatest hits of the work that we've done in the Monadnock region. And I know that many of them are familiar to you. But the first one, and this is the first real project I worked on with my students starting back in 2002, was the Swansea Fish Dam. And how we set out to answer a basic question, because it had never really been established to the satisfaction of many archaeologists that this was built and used by native people. So I talk about what we know about the dam historically. I talk about the late Art Whipple, who was a tremendous guide and source of information for me, and how he took me to that dam when I first arrived in the region. And I talk about doing excavation on the banks of the Ashwillet River, and what evidence we would need to find to really pin down that this was a Native American feature. And of course, we were successful in doing this. Combination of diagnostic artifacts and radiocarbon dates strongly indicates the dam was built about 4,000 years ago, and then used more or less continuously up to the time of European contact. But even more than that, and sort of the second major theme that came out of the book was, it fits with the title of A Deep Presence, but the amazing continuity of Native people in particular areas, like the Sawyer's Crossing area of Swansea. Because to get down to the Swansea Fish Dam, every day when we parked our van, we would walk over the Whipple site, the Paleo-Indian site, pass by that, walk down the bank of the river, almost like you're marching through time, and get down here and work on this site. And when you take all the information from the Sawyer's Crossing area, the collections in the Historical Society, the accounts and local histories about a 18th century fort being built here, it shows this amazing continuous occupation and continuity. The second site I talk about is really, in a way, sort of a prosaic day in the life site. And it's a nice sandy knoll way out in the forest at the headwaters of Nubanusset Brook, which is one of the tributaries of the Contoocook River. The site was discovered about 25 years ago when the Army Corps of Engineers had a survey done with a real minimal amount of archaeological testing, and still managed to find 7 sites within the dam's impoundment. And one of them was on a little knoll where the excavators, who were from PAL, found a handful of quartz flakes. And in 2006, we went out there to see if there was anything more than that. And what we found was a multi-component site. And the distribution of artifacts made it look like small groups of people had come here, spent brief periods of time hunting, fishing, gathering plant foods, trapping. We had the remains of beaver and the remains of 3 different species of turtle. All of these identified by my colleague Tanya Largy and her colleagues at the Harvard Peabody. And this is one of these sites that wasn't a habitation site, but a place that people would come and work for a day or an afternoon. And it was in really pristine condition. You got a really nice glimpse of these short periods of time. But it also begged the question, if this was just a temporary work site, if you will, where did people go at night? Where was their actual home, their residence? And the most likely location here is a few miles down the Nubanusset, where it joins the Contoocook River. And there's a nice sandy terrace there, an ideal location for a native habitation site. And this past summer with COVID, my wife and I would, from time to time, go down to Peterborough, get some takeout food. And there's a little park right at the confluence with a single picnic table. And we'd go and sit and eat our food and watch the water go by. And I think after the 3rd or 4th time, I was probably driving her nuts, because each time I'd say the same thing. I'd sit there and look at the confluence and say, wow, I bet there was a remarkable site here. But in the 19th century, they built a railroad right through it. And when you sit there at the picnic table and look at the banks of the river, you're looking at sewer pipes and you're looking at riprap, and you're right next to a strip mall and there are underground utilities, and there's nothing left in all likelihood of that site. So that if you're going to learn something about the people who were centered there, you've got to go a few miles up the Nubanusset and look at places where they might have spent their afternoons. The third site I look at is a really remarkable site in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, another site that the late Art Whipple shared with me. And what it was, as you can see in this picture here, was just a narrow little strip of alluvial terrace pinned to the side of Wintastigit Mountain. And it was actively eroding into the Connecticut River. And Art Whipple had found pottery and some points coming out of the bank. So we clearly knew there was a site there. Looking at it just like that, it seems an unlikely location for a habitation site. I mean, there's not really much land to work on. So you have the eroding bank here, and right beyond my student's leg here, the terrain starts to get rocky and head up the slopes of Wintastigit Mountain. But of course, it wasn't always like that. And if you look at these historic topographic maps, you have these, this one here is from 1893. You have these 2 large islands in the Connecticut River. And they were at one time attached to the New Hampshire side. And you can tell that from the soil survey maps. The soil of these islands is the same as the New Hampshire side, but different from the Vermont side. And by 1893, the river had formed a channel and cut them off from the mainland. And then between the construction of the Vernon Dam and the 1938 hurricane, almost all of those islands is gone by the time you get up to the 1980s. And all that is left is this little strip of soil that's rapidly dropping into the Connecticut River. So we started this very much as a salvage operation to just try to save what was there. Worked on it in 2004. And then in 2005, the Franklin Pierce crew was joined by people from the scrap program. It turned out to be a remarkable site with fairly deep stratified deposits ranging from about 700 years old all the way back to more than 5,000 years old. It's based on diagnostic artifacts and a whole series of radiocarbon dates. But really the most distinctive thing about the site were these small little vertebrae that we were finding. And when Tanya Largy and her colleagues looked at them, almost all of them were identified as snakes. We had 5 different species of snakes here, but far and away the most common variety was the eastern timber rattlesnake. And these weren't just coming from one snake because they were distributed all throughout the stratigraphic sequence. And to this day, the top of Wintasticate Mountain is one of the last refuges of this snake in the state of New Hampshire. They were so abundant that in the 19th century, they were being hunted commercially. And so we had evidence here of 5,000 years of continuous use of this animal. And that led me to really wonder, to pose a question, which I am not able to answer in the book. What were they doing with the snakes? There's plenty of evidence that they were eaten as food, but there's also plenty of evidence from the history of New England's native people and from other native people that these were regarded as sacred animals. And so I have a discussion about how you can figure that out and what the distinction between them might have been. And then the fourth site that I talk about, and no surprise here, what in all likelihood for me is going to be the site of a lifetime is the Tennant Swamp Paleo-Indian site that we discovered prior to the construction of the Keene Middle School. And as many of you know, it's an absolutely remarkable site where we had the well-defined outlines marked by oval-shaped concentrations of artifacts of where 4 tents had been erected. And within these tents, we have a couple hundred stone tools, debitage from sources in far northern New Hampshire, very tight clusters of burned bone in the center of each oval, marking the location of a fire, bones identified as caribou, and a radiocarbon date of 12,600 years before present, making this one of the oldest dated sites in all of New England. It's an absolutely remarkable opportunity to travel back in time and to ask really detailed questions about the activities taking place within these houses, the number of people who could be there, the possible structures of families, gender-based division of labor, all this sort of thing comes out. We had the assistance of some really remarkable specialists. Heather Rockwell conducted use wear analysis on the tools, which gave us all sorts of insight, including some tools that actually had the traces of prehension from having been gripped so tightly in the human hand. We had Art Spiess identifying caribou bone. We had Chris Dorian doing the geomorphological study. It just painted an incredible picture of some of the very first inhabitants to come into this part of the state. And also, when I'm telling the story, it's not just about the site, but this started off as a CRM project, a Section 106 project, kicked off by the school needing to get a wetlands permit to build this close to a swamp. And so in this chapter, I also introduce the layperson to what that process is like, how it works, how it's implemented, and what happens when you have a really significant site where there has got to be this really crucial development, and how you balance those and sort of make it a positive outcome for everyone. And in this case, it really was a positive outcome because we ended up working, and this was built into the mitigation plan. We ended up working with the teachers at the middle school to take the data that we had from that campus and integrate it into their classroom. And all 4 of these sites together really give you a remarkable sense of the interesting and deep nature of Native history here. I have a concluding chapter. It's only a couple of pages, but before I get to the conclusion, I try to do what often doesn't get done, which is bring the story of the Native people up to the present and not just leave it back at the dawn of European contact. And so I talk about what happens to the Abenaki. I talk about the effects of disease and epidemics. I talk about a little bit about the French and Indian Wars and how those played out. And I talk about why it seems that after those wars come to an end around 1760 or so, why the Abenaki seem to disappear, and how that's led so many people to say that they were extinct, and that they're a story that has come to the end. And one of the things I'm able to do is introduce in that chapter a remarkable story of an Abenaki family in Keene, the Sedekis family, who had come down from the Abenaki village of Odanak in Quebec in the 1880s, taking a canoe down the Connecticut River and settling in Keene and becoming known throughout the community as Keene's Indians. The Sedekises were very popular. The father, Israel, worked as a basket maker and a hide tanner. Two of their daughters may have been the first American Indian registered nurses in the United States. It's really a remarkable family. And when we had the book launch for the book on Indigenous Peoples Day on October 11th, we had over 200 people come to the event, both in person and virtually. And those more than 200 people included two of Elizabeth Sedekis's granddaughters. And you can see this picture of Elizabeth on the left. And I finished the book. The very last picture in the book is a picture of my friend Sherry Gould, who is a master Abenaki basket maker. And it's a picture of her teaching this art form a couple of years ago at a history event in Hillsborough. And so I very much try to take it up to the present and end by saying that this is a story that still has quite a few chapters to be written. So that is the outline of the book. And I'm hoping that my colleagues in archaeology will find it interesting and an enjoyable read. And I am really hoping that it's embraced by people in the public, and that it makes a contribution toward reversing the invisibility that's been imposed on Native history. We were a little nervous when it came time to actually send the book to the publisher. And one of the questions was, how many books should we have printed? We did not want to get stuck with a pallet of moldering books in the basement of the Historical Society. And we had this very lofty financial goal with this project, which was not to lose money. And so after talking it over, we decided to go long, and we had 2,000 copies of the book printed. And we're crossing our fingers, wondering how it was going to sell. The book has been out for a little over a month now. The official unveiling was October 11th, Indigenous Peoples Day. And in that time period, I am really delighted to say that we have sold almost 1,400 books at this point. And we are actually going to a second printing, and the second printing is going to arrive in January. So it's really exceeded our expectations. I'm happy, the Harris Center's happy, the Historical Society's happy. So it has been a very enjoyable project. I know some of you have copies of the book. I'm very interested to hear what you think about it. And so that is my tale. I had a lot of people who helped with this project, and this is a very long list. It includes many of my colleagues. It includes some of my students at Franklin Pierce University who co-authored papers with me, who have gone on to be professional archaeologists. It includes really important people like my late friend, Art Whipple. So there were a lot of people who in different ways made contributions to this project. And so with this long list here, I would like to just acknowledge some of them. And so that is my tale. And I would be delighted to hear what you have for questions. And I know Dick has been gathering those, so I can turn it over to Dick at this point. If you're interested in ordering a book, there are a number of ways to do it. The best way from the standpoint of the sponsors is to go to, say, the Harris Center webpage, and that will take you directly to the distributor and save us the rather large cut that Amazon or Barnes and Noble will take. But however you get it, if you do, I say thank you in advance, and I hope you enjoy it. So, okay, I think I turn it over to Dick now.
Well, thank you. One question that I have is, was there something that in retrospect you wanted to include in the book? Like, oh, if I had to do over again, I'd put such and such in. Was there anything like that? Did something nag you from behind saying, why am I not in there?
Yeah. There were quite a few things. I mean, there were other sites I've worked on that I thought about including. But in the end, there were a lot of things that I just, because of the kind of book that it was becoming and the kind of book I wanted it to be, I just said, I can't do that. I can't include it. I want it to be relatively short, fairly concise. So, there are a lot of things that are not going to go in there. I can't think of any one particular issue. But yeah, a lot of things wound up on the cutting room floor.
And sort of stemming from that, do you have any new writing projects coming up? When do you get to see the next book?
Yeah, now that I've got one, I had so much fun. I'd love to do another. And I've been sort of scratching my head about, what I would write about. That's a fun problem to have. For the moment, the one writing project, and like a lot of my colleagues, I'm very good at promising to write things when the deadline is a year out, and then when it's coming up on a month away, I start to go into panic mode. But one of the themes that came out of this book, like I said, was this idea of the big world of Native people, whether they were Paleo Indians or Middle Archaic people who are making their points in the same style as people all up and down the Atlantic seaboard, or Middle Woodland people who are involved in really long distance exchange networks, or the Abenaki of the 17th and 18th century who were involved in an international trade and political struggle. But the idea of the big world of the Abenaki. And so I promised some time ago to write a paper in that vein for Historical New Hampshire, the Journal of the New Hampshire Historical Society. And so that will be my next one, at least short term.
Great. Someone wants to know, how was it to work with your wife, the English professor, as part of this whole process? Feel free to claim anonymity here.
Yep. It was good. Okay. And the way I approach that is it's a little awkward though, because if you spend a long time writing something like that and then you give it to your wife, you do sort of put her on the spot. And always in the back of my mind, I've got enough insecurity, so there's a little part of me saying, oh geez, what if it stinks? And is that really going to put her on the spot? Fortunately for me, my wife has never had a problem telling me when I need to get my game up. And so I did not really give it to her until it was finished. And I gave her a draft, and the first question I had was not for her to read it as a technical editor, although she did do that as well. But simply to read it from almost the standpoint of literature. Was it a good story? How did it read? And so she was the first one to really see the manuscript and reassure me that it was worth going forward with. So that was very positive. Yep. And I owe her quite a bit. The book is dedicated to her for many reasons, but that's one of the many.
And Excuse me, Linda mentioned earlier that you'll be the guest editor for the 2023 volume of the Archaeologist. Did you have any ideas so far as to what you'd like to see in that particular issue?
Yeah. And again, that's one of those things where when it's a couple years out, sounds like a great idea. I still think it's a great idea, and I'm looking forward to it. But the one thing I have been thinking about is there is a huge lag in my experience between the work being done by consulting archaeologists and work that gets published for a broader audience. The so-called gray literature that just winds up in archives or only read by a handful of people doing review and compliance. That literature is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And most people in consulting archaeology, they simply don't have the time to take a lot of these very interesting projects to the next level. And so we never learn about them. And so I was thinking very much I'd like to really bug my colleagues who are doing this work and try to find some of those hidden gems in the gray literature and bring those forward.
We have a question about Abenaki sites in Vermont. You've focused on New Hampshire, which I think is perfectly reasonable. But to our friends across the river, can you speak to any sites of note that relate to Abenaki history in Vermont?
Yeah. I do talk about a couple of Vermont sites, and in fact, the book begins and ends at Bellows Falls. So in that sense, I do get over that way a little bit. I make reference to other sites in Vermont, but I also in that sort of extended chapter 3, one of the things I talk about there is I have a subheading. It's simply called water. And I talk about river drainages and how we understand them. And of course, to us, New Hampshire and Vermont are different places. They're separated by a boundary, which is a river. And boy, do they have different political cultures and all of this sort of thing. We see those differences. To the Abenaki, certainly then, and I think even now, that river's not a boundary. That river is a center. And I don't think they would have seen a distinction between which side of the river you were on. And I'm talking about the people on this side because this is where I've done my work. But I think it applies equally to the people on the left bank. So because I think they were the same people. So
absolutely. Your cover of Deep Presence shows the artwork, the reconstruction at Tennant Swamp. Is there a place where we can see more of this artwork?
Yeah, there's one other place where this has appeared publicly. One of the things that the teachers at the middle school did when we were finished with the excavation is they took that information and they raised money to build an educational boardwalk going out into Tennant Swamp that addresses all sorts of issues from the plants to wetland ecology, but begins with a sign on the Paleo-Indian occupation. And Miranda Nelkin has another beautiful illustration that is on that sign. We're also working on a project, and we actually had a meeting today at the Historical Society in Keene. We're working on a project to develop a set of 6 educational posters for public schools in this region that will feature different aspects of Native history. And each poster will include an original drawing by Miranda that is inspired by either an archaeological excavation or say by, a historic photograph of the Sedekis family or something of this sort. And working with the Historical Society, we're going to distribute these to every school in the region so they can use them in social studies and history and sort of spread more of this information. So there may be more of these illustrations to come soon.
Have you had much feedback from the Native community about the book? Good, bad, and different?
Yeah.
You're well connected with the Native communities here in New England, and I'm just curious as to what you've received in feedback from them.
Yeah. It's a funny thing. As soon as the book came out, actually before the book came out, I was just really wondering, oh gosh, are people going to like it? And like I said before, I'm insecure enough, so I wonder about those things. And I wondered about it in different ways. I wonder what my colleagues in archaeology would think, and I wonder what just average people in the general public would think. And I really wondered about my Native friends and colleagues, because here I am trying to tell their history. And I say very early on in the book that what you're getting here is simply my version of it. And that's all it is. And yet it's still out there. Okay? It's still a book on Native history. It's still a book on the Abenaki written by somebody who is not Native. So far, everything I have received back has been positive. And I've been doing a lot of book events in the last couple of weeks. And one of the ones was at the public library in Brattleboro, New Hampshire. And that was actually organized by an Abenaki group based in Vermont. And they hosted me and helped me with book sales and things of that sort. And I've gotten positive feedback from a couple other people in that community. But I'm still watching closely to see how that comes in, with my fingers crossed.
And just out of curiosity, what do you have teed up for future fieldwork for yourself, either through your company or from your institution?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the fun things about being an archaeologist. You never know what is around the corner. And right now I'm in one of those spots where I'm waiting for the next interesting thing to come around the corner. I've got a couple of possibilities. I have been, and I can't say much about it, but I've been involved in some of the discussions about what's going to happen with the Weirs Beach site up in Laconia. Unfortunately, even though this book lays out 20 years of work with my Franklin Pierce students, I think that is a story that has come to an end. Franklin Pierce, like a lot of schools of its type, has been experiencing sharply declining enrollments, and they're moving much more toward a sort of professional training model and away from a liberal arts model. And this year, the anthropology program was eliminated. So I'm still teaching there and hope to be for another few years before I retire. But I do not expect you'll see more archaeology coming out of Franklin Pierce, which is a shame. We've had a long tradition there going back to Howard Sargent, more than 50 years of doing this work. On the positive side, we had a good run, and this book is sort of the culmination of that.
I see. Well, I think that we have drained the questions from the audience. So I'd like to thank you. And to go back to my script, we'd really like to get feedback from the audience about this whole event here this evening. Either put it into the chat column here, or email president@nhas.org. And in the self-promotion department, you can view our future activities by bookmarking and visiting our website, nhas.org. You can follow us on the New Hampshire Archaeological Society Facebook and Instagram sites. These links are posted in the chat. You can also email secretary@nhas.org, that's me, if you want to be added to our email list. And if you're not already a member, please consider showing your support by joining the Society at our nhas.org website. And so, thank you for attending the annual meeting, and I'll turn it back to Linda Ferderer, our president, for some final words.
Well, I'd just like to say, Bob, thank you so much for another great presentation. We really appreciate that you're always willing and eager to do these presentations for us. I would like to thank everybody else for attending tonight. I look forward to seeing you in the spring, hopefully face to face. And stay well and be safe. And good night, everyone.